The anthropological study of religion may be very different from your previous experiences with religion. You should recall from the beginning of class that anthropologists start from the individual and the community and only then work up to the larger picture. Thus, anthropologists are less interested in the big religions and their tenets of faith, in effect, the beliefs of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. Instead, they are more interested in the day-to-day practice of religion, how it impacts people's lives. Anthropology is also not interested in questions regarding the ultimate truth or falsity of any religion. Ken Guest put it very well when he wrote, quote, "We understand that religious worlds are real, meaningful, and powerful to those who live in them." In other words, the ultimate truth of a religion does not matter, because for a believer, a religion is ultimately true, whether we choose to agree with them or not. What is your image of a Buddhist monk? A quiet, meditating man in flowing robes? Men living by a doctrine of nonviolence and peace? Men who refuse to eat meat due to the violence of killing animals for food? What about leading protests and marching in the streets to overthrow a government? In 2007, thousands of monks took to the streets of Myanmar's capital city. For decades, the country had endured a violent and repressive military government. In 2007, the government raised fuel prices by 500%. The cost of fuel can have a profound effect on an economy. Anything that needs to be transported to a store or market uses fuel to get there. Thus, when fuel prices went up by 500%, prices on virtually all goods, everything from eggs to cooking oil, also went drastically up. In a nation where the majority of the citizens live in poverty, this was a big problem. The nation's population took to the streets in protest. They quickly found that they were no match for the government's military power. The protesters were beaten back by the military, and the government nearly succeeded in quelling resistance. But then they made a fatal mistake. The military shot and beat several Buddhist monks. Myanmar's population is deeply religious, and Buddhist monks are considered among the most sacred people in the nation. The physical assault on the monks reinvigorated the protests against the government. Thousands of the nation's monks took to the streets to join the protests. They marched in the streets flanked by thousands of citizens who were willing to bodily protect these monks. In the end, the 2007 protest was just one of many, and by 2011, the military junta that had controlled the country for decades was officially dissolved. The nation still has many troubles to resolve, but the monks had their say, and the military rule is gone. For religious men and women devoted to peace and tranquility, this is a tremendous display of political power. As we have seen throughout the semester, systems of power are pervasive throughout human cultures. They interact with everything from economics, politics, race, gender, to, of course, religion. While monks do not typically seek to overthrow governments around the world, religion nevertheless is an extremely powerful influence on people and their daily lives. It is one of the primary sources we use to define morality. It dictates daily activities in the form of rituals and worship. It often informs what we think of as a proper and moral life. As we move forward, we will explore the role of religion in power. However, it's important to remember from the beginning that religious systems have a great deal of power in most cultures around the world. Over the course of this lecture, we will be asking several questions from the chapter about religion, including what is religion? What tools do anthropologists use to understand how religion works? In what ways is religion both a system of meaning and a system of power? And how is globalization changing religion? What is religion? Religions and religious expressions are extremely diverse around the world. While they have some things in common, it often seems easier to identify their differences than their similarities. As a result, coming up with a definition for religion is extremely difficult. At the same time, you all have an intrinsic idea of what I mean by the term religion. Let's step back and look at how anthropologists have attempted to define religion. Seeking a working definition. Anthropologists are less interested in the specific doctrines found in any religion than they are with how that religion affects people and their lives. Thus, Anthropologists approach religion from a perspective of practice. That is, what does it mean to practice a religion rather than necessarily adhere to or believe in a particular religion? From this perspective, anthropologists have identified 7 core elements to religious belief and practice around the world. 1. A belief in powers or deities whose abilities transcend the natural world. In effect, a belief in some form of supernatural power. 2. Myths and stories about the meaning and purpose of life. These myths also often cover how life originated and the role of humans in the universe. 3. A set of ritual activities that reinforce or instill these collective beliefs. This can include acts like private prayer, worship services, ceremonies, etc. 4. A symbol system used in religious practice that represents key aspects of the religion or tenets of faith. For example, the crucifix or cross in Christianity, the Star of David in Judaism, and the Star and Crescent in Islam. 5. Identifiable specialists in the religion who assist or instruct the average believer, such as priests, rabbis, etc. 6. Institutions that preserve, explore, teach, and implement the religion's beliefs. These can be everything from a simple countryside chapel to archives and libraries that seek to preserve a religion's history. 7. A community of believers. Much like when we first defined culture, we said that a culture required a community. The beliefs and practices of one person represent a single and isolated experience. Only when a group of people share a belief system can we call it a religion. And not every religion incorporates all 7 of these core elements. Some religions emphasize certain elements more than others. By and large, most world religions will fall within this spectrum, though. Local expressions and universal definitions. When we think of religions from the large-scale perspective, we tend to think of them as following a set of definitions. That is, we can divide them up into distinct religions with a universal set of practices. We imagine that all Hindus follow a certain set of beliefs. All Christians subscribe to their own set of beliefs, which are different from those of Hindus, and so on. If someone does not follow a set of beliefs as we prescribe them, then they cannot be members of that religion. Thus, if someone said they were a Christian but then professed a belief in Hindu concepts of reincarnation, we might say that this person is not a true Christian. These broad definitions, however, are definitions that we impose on the world. They are reflections of our beliefs and not necessarily the beliefs of the people we are describing. Someone who professes to be a Christian is a Christian, at least inasmuch as that is how they see themselves. Therefore, if we want to understand them and their worldview, that is how we have to approach such an individual. When we look at local expressions of religions, we tend to find that they do not match our broader conceptions of what that particular religion should look like. This is why anthropologists are more interested in local practice rather than a religion's theology, scriptures, or histories. We have 2 good examples to look at where local practice is directly contrary to broader conceptions of the religion in question. These people still consider themselves to be practicing believers of the larger religions in question. One is in northern India, where there is a shrine to the Muslim saint Hussein Tekri. Hussein Tekri was a grandson of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. He died a martyr's death. That is, he died in the name of Islam. Shrines to holy people are not uncommon in many religions, but this shrine is said to be possessed of healing powers. Pilgrims come to the shrine from all over India to seek its powers. Those suffering from illness as well as financial ruin come to the shrine seeking to be cleansed or cured by the shrine's power. Such healing shrines are not widely accepted as real by many followers of Islam, and some suggest that they are sacrilegious, that is, contrary to Islamic doctrine. Nevertheless, the practice not only survives, but thrives at the local level. Another interesting factor about the shrine of Hussein Tekri is that it draws many non-Muslims, despite the fact that the shrine is specifically dedicated to the Islamic religion. Many people who self-identify as Hindu, Sikh, or Jain also come to the shrine seeking its powers. This kind of blending of different religious faiths is actually quite common, but it does not fit those overarching definitions of what it means to be Muslim or Hindu. What tools do anthropologists use to understand how religion works? For this section, we want to look at a number of influential thinkers and theories about religion. We will talk about some scholars we've seen before and some that will be new. Just like many other disciplines, the way in which anthropologists approach a topic is heavily influenced by prominent or especially persuasive scholars. These theories affect the way many subsequent generations of scholars have approached religion. Thus, we have to work our way back to the beginning in order to understand the way in which anthropologists approach religion. Beginning with Émile Durkheim. Émile Durkheim was a famous French sociologist who lived in the latter half of the 19th century. His work has been highly influential for both sociology and anthropology. It includes many famous books, including Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Durkheim thought that if he studied the religion of a small and simple culture, for example, a culture organized as a band, that he could learn more about the early forms of human religion. Today, this approach would be considered, or at least challenged, as being racially charged. That is, he was presuming simple cultures are primitive. But Durkheim went forth with his study and picked a group of Australian Aborigines. While anthropologists today would say that Durkheim did not actually get back to an original human religion, his method of analyzing religion still had a profound impact on anthropology as a discipline. In an attempt to define religion, Durkheim focused on the opposing concepts of sacred and profane. By sacred, he meant those practices, people, or objects that are considered holy by a religion. The term profane was used to refer to unholy practices, people, or objects. This concept comes out in Durkheim's attempt to define religion. He stated that religion is, quote, a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, end quote. He was using a communal definition of what is considered to be holy to define a religion. Durkheim also was the first to bring attention to the role of what he called ritual in religion. Today, we would broadly define ritual as religious practice. It is the acts of practicing a religion that create the social structure of a religion. Durkheim saw the act of carrying out rituals as a powerful social tool to bind a society together. Once again, we come back to Karl Marx. We last talked about Marx's theories when we were discussing theories of class and inequality. Marx was particularly interested in the division between the proletariat, the workers, and the bourgeoisie, those who owned the means of production. Marx viewed religion within the framework of his larger views of economy and society. He felt that not only the economy, but also other cultural institutions arose from what he termed the base, or the infrastructure. For Marx, the term infrastructure referred to the economic realities of the world in which people lived. For example, the kind of environment people lived in dictated the types of plants they could grow for food. The environment either did or did not have rich natural resources like coal, iron, or clean water. All of these natural features represented an underlying infrastructure on which cultural institutions could be built. Thus, Marx viewed the dichotomy between proletariat and bourgeoisie as fundamentally built upon the natural infrastructure. The workers did not have access to the raw materials. The bourgeoisie did. Noting that religiosity, i.e., the level of devotion to one's religion, tended to be higher among the proletariat than among the bourgeoisie, Marx viewed religion as a response to the infrastructure. That is, the infrastructure made the proletariat poor and defenseless. Thus, they needed religion as a balm to soothe their rough lives. Marx, however, phrased this more bluntly when he said, "Religion is the opiate of the masses." In the 19th century, opium was used as a common painkiller as well as an illicit drug. Marx was saying that religion was used to dull the pain of life among the proletariat. The full quote goes on to say that it is the, quote, sigh of the oppressed. It gives a sense of consolation. Marx's views on religion were particularly influential on the famous anthropologist Marvin Harris. In his book, Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches, Harris explored Marx's idea that the infrastructure creates social institutions. That is, that your environment affects the way in which your culture develops. Harris used this idea to ask specific questions about religion. For example, why are cows sacred in Hinduism? Hindus practice vegetarianism as part of their religious rituals in general, holding that it is profane to eat meat. But in particular, they elevate cows to a sacred status. Even in times of great famine, cows are found wandering through Hindu villages without hindrance, despite the fact that they could be a simple and easy food source that could save a family from starvation. Harris asked, how could a religious prescription be so strong as to let a family starve? Sticking with an infrastructure-style argument, Harris looked at the economic value of a cow. In the short term, a cow can be eaten as food. There is a specific food value involved, but once eaten, the cow is gone and cannot provide any more for a family. A living cow, however, can give birth to more cows, which can be used as beasts of burden. Harris noted that the ox was the work engine of Indian agriculture. Farmers used oxen to plow their fields for planting, to haul carts of that food during harvest time, and to haul goods to market for trade. A farmer without living oxen was at a considerable disadvantage. Living cows also produce manure, which can be a powerful fertilizer for agricultural fields. Again, if a farmer has no cows, they cannot fertilize their fields. Harris suggested that the prohibition against eating cows came about based on an analysis of relative economic benefits. A cow could be eaten in the short term, but would leave a family hungry next week. Whereas, if cows were maintained alive, they could be used to plow and fertilize fields, thus keeping a family in food year-round. Harris's approach to culture became known as cultural materialism. Those anthropologists who favor cultural materialism suggest that the infrastructure or base environment dictates cultural decisions. Another name we've seen before is Max Weber. Weber was also an influential economic scholar who gave us the ideas of prestige and life chances when we were talking about class and inequality. In discussing class and inequality, Weber largely reinforced the ideas that had been previously forwarded by Karl Marx. But when we look at religion, Weber held very different ideas from Marx. Where Marx saw religion as a creation of the infrastructure and economy, Weber held that religion itself could be a powerful influence on the economy. Weber came to his views on religion via his analysis of the European economy. Specifically, Weber was interested in the rise and development of capitalism in 19th century Europe. By Weber's analysis, rudimentary forms of capitalism had developed in many parts of the world centuries before they had appeared in Europe. But in each of these cases, those first stages of capitalism had not developed into a complex system like that found in Europe. In seeking to answer why this was the case, Weber turned to religion. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber argued that it was European religion that allowed capitalism to thrive. Specifically, Weber identified the strong work ethics and the high value placed on thrift and discipline among many Protestant religious groups. He felt that these values of work and restraint were the perfect flowering ground for complex capitalism. Weber, however, worried that the success of capitalism would increase the rate of cultural secularism, i.e. the abandonment of religion, which in the end would undermine the success of capitalism itself. At least in the case of Europe, the first part of Weber's prediction seems to have come true. Rates of religious belief in Europe are at record lows and continuing to decline. Religious belief in the United States is also on the decline, but in comparison to Europe and other industrialized core nations, the United States has incredibly high rates of religiosity. Whether an abandonment of religious faith will lead to the downfall of capitalism, only time will tell. In his studies of religion, Max Weber had proposed an evolutionary typology of religion as well. That is, he proposed 3 phases of development in world religions. Today, Weber's typology no longer has much influence, but his work does represent the origins of anthropological interest in shamanism, which is one of the most heavily researched subjects in modern anthropology. Because religions tend to have identifiable specialists or religious practitioners, I want to distinguish between priests and shaman before I discuss Weber's typology. Priests are those who hold a full-time religious office, which is often elected or appointed, whereas a shaman is a part-time religious practitioner with the ability to mediate between individuals and supernatural beings. Shamanism represents one of the, quote, simplest forms of religion found on the planet. By simple, we mean that there is no hierarchical structure. Relatively few people are involved as religious specialists. There is a great deal of fluidity in beliefs in religious power as well. Shamanistic religions are focused around individual religious practitioners known as shamans. In academic terms, a shaman is a part-time religious practitioner, as I've already said. That is to say, this is not their full-time job. They still usually have to provide for their subsistence by other means. Shamans have a special and personal connection with supernatural powers or beings. This ability is typically activated through a shamanic trance. Trances are created by a variety of means, including meditation, fasting, and on occasion, the ingestion of a variety of substances, sometimes hallucinogenics or hallucination-inducing substances. In a trance, shamans can petition the supernatural powers for the benefit of their people. The process of becoming a shaman has also been of great interest to anthropologists. Shamanism is predominantly found in simple cultures resembling bands or tribes. In these cultures, social status has to be achieved rather than inherited or bestowed. As a result, in order to become a shaman, you must achieve your standing by personal trial. Shamans typically undergo a variety of initiation rites or trials, rituals. If during the course of these trials they are able to make contact with the divine, they can become a shaman. Different varieties of shamanism have been observed in countless cultures around the world, and these have been studied by many anthropologists. For example, Laurel Kendall studied women shamans in rural South Korea. These women called upon local gods and deceased ancestors on behalf of other women in the community who were seeking assistance with everyday problems such as injuries or illness, troublesome children, a drunken husband, or economic struggles. Once the supernatural powers were channeled by shamanic trances, they would seek to advise or console the women in need of support. Similar scenes of supportive shamanism have been seen in many cultures, including among the Tuareg, with whom I work in Mali. If we are going to talk about religion and supernatural beliefs, we need to also talk about magic. Conceptions of magic vary widely in cultures around the globe, but they are also extremely prevalent, showing up in virtually all cultures. Much like religion, magic can be very difficult to define, particularly when asking whether or not it is even real to begin with. Broadly speaking, we can adopt our definition of power to our concept of magic. We've defined power as the ability to bring about change through action or influence. We can think of magic as the ability to bring about change through supernatural action or supernatural influence. How this supernatural power is used or wielded varies drastically among different cultures, but power is the primary topic. Many anthropologists have studied magic over the years. We will look at 3 prominent examples and then examine just what we think of magic ourselves. We have looked several times at the work of Evans Pritchard among the Nuer in Sudan. This time, we want to look at his work with the Central African cultural group, the Azande. After his time with the Azande, Evans Pritchard published his ethnography, Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. In his ethnography, Evans Pritchard sought to overturn Western pejorative concepts of magic and witchcraft. That is, he sought to overturn the idea that magic was an irrational act practiced by simple-minded natives. He argued instead that magic and witchcraft only appear inconsistent and irrational when they are arranged like museum objects on a shelf and examined outside the context of daily life. Evans Pritchard was critiquing Westerners who would dismiss a cultural tradition as irrational without truly understanding that tradition. Evans Pritchard found that among the Azande, witchcraft was a central element of daily life. Virtually all misfortunes that could happen in life were traced back to witchcraft. If you were ill, it was caused by witchcraft. If someone died, it was caused by witchcraft, and so on. Interestingly, witchcraft could be caused by people without knowing it. Witchcraft was considered to be inherited from a parent and could be carried out unconsciously. In this way, witchcraft was more akin to what modern-day Westerners might call psychic power. No spells or incantations were involved. Witches, both male and female, could simply will things to happen. Thus, witchcraft was found throughout daily life. All misfortunes were caused by it, as I said, and many people could be perpetuating it without ever knowing that they were. Magic, on the other hand, was a deliberate act among the Azande. Magic was consciously performed through incantations and spells by trained witch doctors, a Western term if there ever was one. The witch doctor's primary purpose was to counteract the misfortune created by witchcraft. Using their magic, witch doctors would attempt to identify the source of the misfortune and then ask that person to stop performing witchcraft. Evans Pritchard's work among the Azande was groundbreaking for anthropological studies of magic and highly influential in its devotion to cultural relativity. It became a central cornerstone of modern anthropology. For another example of magic in Africa, we turn to the work of anthropologist Paul Stoller. Stoller's work is unusual in that he was fully initiated as a sorcerer living among Africans in the Songé region of Niger. Stoller, after spending time in local communities, was able to be taken on as an apprentice to a local sorcerer. As part of that experience, he lived the life of a traditional magic practitioner. He had to memorize incantations, he had to eat special foods required as part of the initiation, he ingested powders and wore magical objects for protection. In short, he took the concept of participant observation to its fullest extent. As part of his field research, Stoller also reported incidents that are somewhat more difficult to understand. Stoller claims to have indirectly participated in an attack of sorcery that resulted in the temporary paralysis of the victim. He also claims to have experienced an attack of sorcery himself. He reported that a powerful village sorceress attacked him with spirits, which caused him to experience debilitating physical effects. After this event, he left the field and returned home. You may recall from the beginning of the chapter that Ken Guest stated that anthropologists, quote, understand that religious worlds are real, meaningful, and powerful to those who live in them. Thus, it is not our place to judge a religion or an act of magic as real or unreal, but instead to understand that it is real to the person who experiences it. We might ask what happened with Stoller during his fieldwork. Did he become a believer? Was the magic real? Or was it real because he was a believer? We have one final example of magical beliefs, but this time we are not looking at traditional culture in remote parts of Africa. This time we're talking about professional baseball players in the United States of America as studied by George Gemelch. Baseball players are notorious for their superstitious beliefs. If they win 3 games without washing their socks, then their socks are never washed again. If a pitcher touched the bill of his cap before throwing a pitch the last time he struck out a batter, then he will keep touching the bill of his cap before throwing a pitch. These kinds of repetitive acts have been documented time and time again by numerous sources, including by Gemelch. A cultural pattern of beliefs has developed among these athletes that favor the use of repetitive acts with the belief that they will bring about a desired outcome. You may be inclined to think that these are just little superstitions and do not amount to magic. But if you recall, our definition of magic was the ability to bring about change through supernatural action or supernatural influence. Baseball players carry out these acts of repetitive magic with the specific intent to make a change through these actions. Thus, magic is alive and well in the modern United States, and it is practiced by culturally prominent individuals. With all of our examples of magic in mind, do you believe in magic? In what ways is religion both a system of meaning and a system of power? In his essay, Religion as a Cultural System, anthropologist Clifford Geertz explored the roles of symbols in religion. Essentially, Geertz argued that religious symbols carried deep levels of meaning that helped to create reality for religious practitioners. The interaction with religious symbols on a regular basis reminds believers of the reality of their religion. Thus, belief and meaning are constantly reinforced and created. Take, for example, the ritual of communion within Christianity. The act of eating bread and drinking wine carries incredibly deep meanings for Christians. The objects themselves symbolize the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Thus, they symbolize the divine. But more than that, the bread and wine represent the sacrifice made by Jesus Christ when he allowed himself to be crucified by the Romans. For Christians, this is an incredibly powerful act, whereby their prophet and the divine Son of God offered himself as a sacrifice for the benefit of all humanity. Imagine you knew nothing about Christianity and you saw someone eating bread and drinking wine. Would you even think twice about it? Could you imagine that such a simple act would have such deep significance? For Geertz, the meaning of these symbols, as well as these symbolic acts, create the cultural system of religion. As we said at the beginning of this lecture, we cannot talk about religion without talking about power. Power is negotiated through all cultural systems, and perhaps even more with religious systems. Religion is also a system that provides explicit meaning to many people in their daily lives. We have to balance our understanding of religion between its meaning and its use as a system of power. Anthropologist Talal Asad objects to Geertz's explanation of religion. For Asad, it is not enough that we simply accept symbols as imbued with meaning. He asks, where did this meaning come from, and how was it established as canonical? Or as he terms it, what was the, quote, authorizing process that gave a symbol its meaning? Asad argues that the meanings behind religious symbols was produced through a complex historical process through which meanings were created, contested, and maintained. In other words, processes that were rife with power and contention. Asad also cautioned against Western scholars taking too narrow a view of religion. He was concerned that the preconceptions and cultural backgrounds of anthropologists would misguide them in their study of religion within other cultures. For this reason, he argued against using universal definitions for religion. He suggested that such definitions only limit an anthropologist's ability to conceive and understand religion. It is very important to always remember the dynamics of both power and meaning when we approach religion. Whether or not we share a belief in the meanings behind a religion, its constituents do, and that makes their experience real and important for them. Blurring the boundaries between meaning and power, religion and revolution in Mexico. Let's turn and look at the events that occurred in the 1990s in Chiapas, Mexico. The people living in the state of Chiapas are among the poorest in all of Mexico. However, the state sits upon abundant national resources, including oil, natural gas, and hydraulic power. Unfortunately, a majority of these profits from these industries leave the state. Fed up with the repressive economic conditions, a group of local residents led a coordinated march in 4 cities throughout the state on January 1st, 1994. This group became known as the Zapatistas. They advocated for economic equality for the people of Chiapas. The government quickly blamed Samuel Ruiz Garcia, a cardinal in the Catholic Church of Chiapas, for inciting rebellion. This was an extraordinary step since even today approximately 90% of all Mexicans identify as Catholic. Publicly blaming a Catholic cardinal was a dangerous thing for the government to do in a country where the church has such widespread support. Indeed, the Zapatistas movement continued for many more years after the initial protests, despite the government's attempts to crack down on it. We might ask, though, why did the government blame the cardinal? Was there any truth to the charge? In 1959, Pope John XXIII called for a Vatican Council to modernize the Catholic Church. This was a major event in the history of the Catholic Church. The council became colloquially known as Vatican II, because it was only the second Vatican Council that had ever been called in the Church's nearly 2,000-year-long history. The council called for many radical changes, including the abolishment of the Latin Mass in favor of the Mass being performed in local languages. In general, these reforms were aimed at making the church more friendly to its constituents and improving the church's involvement with people's daily lives, rather than simply expecting them to attend Mass once a week. Having absorbed the lessons of Vatican II, Cardinal Ruiz Garcia returned to Chiapas and began to work to implement its message of openness and interest in supporting the people. In particular, the cardinal began to place more emphasis on training catechistas. A catechista was a specially trained lay teacher for the church. That is, they weren't professional teachers or priests, but community members seeking to become more involved in the church. The cardinal dictated that the training of catechistas should take a high priority, and that in their training, issues of community life and social needs should be given just as much attention as church doctrine and scripture. The program was highly successful, and the state went from having just 700 catechistas in 1960 to over 8,000 by the time of the Zapatista revolt. While Cardinal Ruiz Garcia did not organize or support the Zapatistas, the message being spread by the cardinal's catechistas, a message on the importance of community life and social needs, mirrored the calls for social justice being made by the Zapatistas. Did the cardinal lead or conspire with the rebellion? No. However, his policies did build community interest in the issues of social justice that spurred the revolution. This brings us to the end of our lecture. Be sure to read and pay attention to the final section in your chapter, How is Globalization Changing Religion? With the increases in globalization, we have seen increased contacts between people of different faiths. Thus, people have an increased awareness of the existence of other religions. The forces of time-space compression, uneven development, and conflicts between nation-states all affect religions around the world. In what ways do you think globalization has changed religion?